Hello, my name is Matt Heller, and I am the creator of Life Under Flight, which is a web documentary addressing aviation emissions in airport communities. So the first question obviously is, what is an airport community? This is a difficult question because there is no standard definition. If you look in a dictionary, you're not going to find a reliable answer. Throughout my research, I found that the effects from aviation go much further than just the airfield. For example, one study out of Boston found that aviation emissions were detected up to 7 kilometers away from the airport under certain wind conditions. So to highlight and visually show what an airport community is, I decided to make a map. I placed a 10-mile radius around some of the major airports in the United States. Now, this 10-mile radius is not meant to suggest that those living within the radii experience a certain level of risk that those who live outside don't. Rather, it is meant to suggest that those living within this 10-mile radius potentially are exposed to a risk and should be aware of the issue. I used an environmental justice screening tool to grab some demographic data from these airport communities, and I accessed some airport operations data to get number of passengers and number of aircraft operations. Again, I did this for, I believe, so far 7 airports in the US. I hope to expand it more, both domestically and internationally, adding some more spatial information to this 10-mile radius. This map is available on my website in the form of Google Maps, and I also have a downloadable layer for Google Earth Pro that I'd be happy to share with anyone. Some of the major themes that I found looking at these 10-mile radius are pretty self-explanatory. Number one, you have high population density. Obviously, these airports are going to exist in locations where there are a lot of people to transport. Number two is diversity. For example, you have East Boston, which is directly bordering Boston Logan International Airport. That is a predominantly Latino community. Meanwhile, you have Winthrop, which is across the bay under one of the flight paths, and that is a more middle to upper middle class, predominantly white community. So very diverse. You've got airports like Seattle-Tacoma out in the Seattle region, which have very high levels of diversity. I believe over half of the people in that area are of color, and similar to Boston, around a quarter have a low income. So now that we know what an airport community is, what's actually affecting these people. Now, aviation emissions is difficult. Globally, global aviation emits around 2.5% of the world's carbon dioxide, which would rank it about 7th if it were a country. It's about the same as the country of Germany releases. But I'm going to focus on one particular portion of the emissions that's very important to airport communities, and that is particulate matter. There's 3 main types of particulate matter defined by particle diameter. That is PM10, PM2.5, and ultrafine particles. Let's start with PM2.5. Due to the extensive amount of research done over the past few decades on PM2.5, science has been able to confidently make statements of causation between exposure to PM2.5 and adverse health outcomes. Therefore, it is regulated by the EPA at a national level, but as I will get into a little bit later, that doesn't necessarily mean much for aviation. Let's take a look at this chart very quickly. So, these boxes here are the general population. So how we read this kind of goes something like this. Let's take a look at heart, so cardiovascular issues. Among the general population, short-term exposure to PM2.5 is known to cause increase in blood pressure. Long-term exposure to PM2.5 is known to cause heart disease, blood clots, heart failure, stroke, heart attacks, cardiac-related death. PM2.5 is a big problem for both cardiovascular and respiratory, and there are likely causes between PM2.5 exposure and issues with the reproductive system and the brain and spinal cord, so the nervous system. Now let's take a look at ultrafine particles. There's less research done on ultrafine particles. Science is still trying to understand what these particles are, how they affect health. Upon an initial glimpse at this graph, this chart, it may seem that exposure to ultrafine particles is actually safer than PM2.5 because you see this word inadequate, you see all this green. This, however, is not necessarily true. And again, because of the limited research, it is not regulated at the national level at this moment. Many of my interviewees said that exposure to ultrafine particles is likely more dangerous than exposure to PM2.5. It really boils down to the fact that these particles are tiny. They are less than 100 nanometers in size, and they have the ability to pass the blood-brain barrier and enter directly into the nervous system. This is why we see a likely cause of brain and spinal cord symptoms, so not cardiovascular, nervous system, among the general population, inflammation in the brain, altered brain development, neurodegeneration, even precursor to Alzheimer's. I can almost guarantee you if this graph were to be updated in a few years, you would see a lot more statements of causation. So now we are going to see a video and hear from some of my interviewees about their experience with aviation emissions.
The airport did a health study in 2014 that showed us that kids have a 360% greater chance here of showing asthmatic symptoms than kids in other neighborhoods, and adult COPD is doubled here. I'm thinking one mom, she has cancer, and her doctors say there's no way this wasn't environmentally caused.
There's also a lot of nasal cavity to throat cancers that occur in a lot of aviation professionals. We get moved from our briefing office straight to the bottom of the airplane. So we're outside exposed to all the exhaust fumes and everything from other airplanes around us starting up. It was like the aviation toxicity syndrome, where it's like fumes that kind of get mixed into our ventilation systems. It really affected quite badly a few of the pilots that had to deal with that. People were knocked out for a bit. They would have memory loss and stuff like that.
If you take the Harvard Six Cities study, which is by far the most important study of the last 100 years in air pollution health, when they analyzed the results, they found massive mortality associated with PM2.5 relative to anybody's expectations.
I almost died because I got an aneurysm that luckily didn't burst. I had bronchitis for 3 years straight. I have early symptoms of COPD. I'm an old man who has never smoked, but has all the symptoms of somebody who's smoked. I got permanent scarring on my lungs.
So now we know this is a big problem. What is being done to address it? Thankfully, in some of these communities, there is a lot of mitigation and advocacy work going on. This top picture here is Scott Hersey. He is a professor of engineering at the Allen College of Engineering in Wellesley, Massachusetts. He is also the advisor for a group called Air Partners. Their main goal is to collect air quality data that is used both for personal exposure assessment as well as for research use. They recently created an app that allows community members to see lifetime air quality data to assess their exposure. So they can look right at their phones, they can see what the air quality is looking like outside at multiple locations across the greater Boston area, and ultimately decide whether it's safe or not for them or their children to be outside. So again, community air quality monitoring is a big thing in terms of mitigation. There's also a big focus on self-advocacy. Groups like Mothers Out Front East Boston. You heard from one of their co-founders in the video. They are using the power of people and personal stories to bring light to this issue in mainstream media. They're also working with groups like Scott's to empower residents, so not only are they aware of their exposure to these emissions, but they know how to protect themselves. Despite this work, however, there is still a difficult relationship with authorities. I'm going to use the Boston narrative as an example. Multiple of my interviewees mentioned the disconnect between the community and high levels of administration. So in Boston, Massachusetts Port Authority, or Massport, oversees operations at Logan International Airport. However, I've heard from multiple people that Massport is sending out sort of buffer personnel that are talking with community members. So people like Scott, Mothers Out Front, other researchers and advocates aren't able to talk to the high-level administration at Massport, and this is frustrating. You can see on your handout a quote from Chris Marshy. He is the Vice President of Airport Impact Relief Incorporated, and for people like him, again, this is very frustrating to not be able to have confident, direct relationships and conversations with the people whose actions are directly affecting and harming the residents. Thankfully, there are some pathways to solutions. First, local, national, and international legislation is a must. I'm going to continue using the Boston narrative here. So the Massachusetts Port Authority has spent millions and millions of dollars funding soundproofing initiatives in dwellings around the airport. They do so because they are forced by the FAA, since the FAA regulates sound. Now, on your handout, you will see this term called HEPA, which stands for High Efficient Particulate Air Filters. These are filtration systems that have been proven successful in decreasing pollution, especially this particulate matter, in indoor situations. Many people, including some high-level officials in the Massachusetts government, have recommended that the Massachusetts Port Authority fund HEPA filter installations in local schools, residences, and municipal buildings. However, they have yet to do so because they're not forced at a national level. Despite having the ability at a pretty low cost to provide healthy breathing air for their residents, they have yet to do so. National and international legislation is also a must to encompass and target the industry as a whole. ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organization, and they recently came out with an aircraft emission standard. Shortly after, earlier this year, the Environmental Protection Agency copied and adopted that standard as well. So not only does it now apply to international aviation under ICAO, but it applies to US domestic aviation under the EPA. This standard had the ability to significantly reduce aviation emissions by forcing airlines and aircraft manufacturers to invest in technology that would reduce emissions. However, it failed to do so. The majority of aircraft in operation and in development already meet the standard. Those that don't, it will only take minor adjustments to meet it. It pretty much deliberately states in the EPA standard that this ruling is more anti-backsliding, so emissions aren't necessarily going to get worse, but they're also not going to get much better. There are reduced and zero emission options that exist. On your handout, you can see definitions for things such as sustainable aviation fuels, electric and hydrogen aircraft. Many airlines are now investing in sustainable aviation fuels, which use different feedstock as opposed to crude oil for Jet A1 fuel. They're using feedstocks such as forest residue and used cooking oil. And in the grand scheme, they are reducing life cycle carbon emissions from extraction to flight. However, the current production of sustainable aviation fuels is less than 1% of global aviation fuel, so it really needs to be scaled up to make much of a difference. There are also electric and hydrogen aircraft in development. You've got, for example, Beta Technologies right here in Burlington, Vermont. They are experimenting with electric aircraft and have funding from some major organizations such as United Therapeutics. They recently accomplished a flight, a totally electric flight from Plattsburgh over to Burlington Airport, which is an internationally recognized accomplishment. However, there are drawbacks to both of these zero-emission technologies. Electric flight right now can only handle regional transport. The available battery technology right now can't lift large, heavy aircraft off the ground and cannot power long-distance flights. However, at the regional level, it still could make a significant impact. The issue with hydrogen right now is that of safety. It isn't necessarily safe to store a lot of hydrogen, which is quite flammable in aircraft, so that's something that's being investigated. However, due to all the investment in these reduced and low emission options, there is the chance that we will see electric or even hydrogen powered aircraft within the next decade or so. Not only are these startup companies working on it, but you've got major aircraft manufacturers such as Boeing and Airbus doing the same. So to finish off, what is the future of airport communities? Ultimately, it boils down to getting people aware of the situation at hand. Aviation is a volatile business. A lot of money is being shifted around daily. Airlines are coming and going. There's a disconnect between the airlines and the airport themselves. All this means that the industry doesn't want people to know living near an airport can be harmful, because when people find out and start raising their voice, the industry is going to have to do something, and they're going to have to spend money, which is going to hurt them economically. And unfortunately, they don't want to do that. Hopefully, as society as a whole becomes more environmentally conscious, environmental justice issues such as living in an airport community will find its spotlight, and these people will be treated the way that they should be. So I think this Delta Airbus A321 says it the best. Thank you, and I am open to questions.